All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about the market forces of supply and demand. This roughly corresponds with Chapter 4 of your textbook. This is the first chapter of our second unit. In many ways, this is quite possibly the most important chapter that we're going to cover because the laws of supply and demand are probably the one thing that, no matter what, every single economics course is going to cover. Microeconomics, macroeconomics, behavioral economics, it doesn't matter what kind of economics you're studying, supply and demand are its central tenet. So, first thing I want to talk about is what do we mean by a market? A market is any group of buyers or sellers for a particular good or service. It could be highly organized, it could be highly disorganized. So what I mean by that is, for example, an organized market might be the stock market, where there are specific rules about how stocks are traded. There are specific places where stocks are traded. There are specific times and people who are allowed to buy and sell stock. A disorganized market is a market where the goods are bought and sold, or goods or services are bought and sold anywhere. So a great example of a disorganized market might be the market for ice cream. If you think about it, you could buy an ice cream cone in many, many different places. You could go to the grocery store. You could go to a Dairy Queen. You could go to many other fast food restaurants. You could go to an ice cream shop. So it's a very, very disorganized market. There's no rules, very few rules at least, about where ice cream can be bought and sold. And what we mean by competition in this case is it's a market where there are so many buyers and sellers. The market is so exceptionally large. So the first kind of economic law we're going to talk about is demand, or what's known as the law of demand. Now, quantity demanded comes from a consumer's willingness and ability to purchase goods and services. Whoops. So the first economic law that we're going to talk about is the law of demand. Now, the law of demand, the first thing you need to recognize, first thing you need to understand is demand comes from consumers, people who are purchasing goods and services. Now, for our purposes, we're going to assume we're dealing with the market for goods and services and not the market for factors of production, but the law of demand does apply to the markets for factors of production as well. And what we're looking at with the law of demand is a consumer's willingness and their ability to purchase a good or service. And it's important that you have to have both. You have to have both the willingness to buy the product and the ability to buy the product. So I would really love to have a Bentley. I can't, in all honesty, say that I have demand for a Bentley because I lack the ability to purchase one. Now, the relationship is quantity demanded and price are negatively or inversely related. So if the price of the good goes up, consumers demand fewer goods. If the price of the good goes down, consumers demand more of the good. And the law of demand is the claim that other things being equal, this is known as ceteris paribus, other things being equal, the quantity demanded of a good falls as the price of a good rises. Now, we can actually plot the information, or we can actually track the information that represents consumers' demand for a good. And we do this using what's called a demand schedule. A demand schedule is simply a table that shows how much of a good consumers are willing to demand at any given price point. These could be for an individual, so we could be looking at one person's demand for, say, ice cream cones, or it could be for a market. So here's an example of an individual demand schedule. At $0, this consumer is willing to buy 12 ice cream cones. At $1, they're willing to buy 8. At $2, they're willing to buy 4, and at $3, they're willing to buy 0. So any price over $3, they're not willing to buy any. A market demand schedule, all you're going to do is you're going to take a number of different consumers, and at each price point, so we're going to look at each price point, okay, you're going to look at how many each consumer demands and then add them together. So for example, in this market, we have Catherine and Nicholas. At $0, Catherine wants 12 ice cream cones, Nicholas wants 7. The market demand is 19. At $2, Catherine demands 4, Nicholas demands 3. The market demand is 7. Now, the demand curve is simply taking the information found on a demand schedule and plotting it on the coordinate system. A demand curve is a graph of the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Price is drawn on the vertical axis, quantity is drawn on the horizontal axis. Now, this is kind of a little bit tricky for kids. Price is actually the independent variable. So traditionally, when you graph the independent variable, you graph it on the horizontal axis. In economics, price is the independent variable, so price determines quantity demanded, not the other way around. However, price is drawn on the vertical axis. This happened as kind of a historical accident. I'll give you a little bit more information about why it's drawn this way in class. For individuals or for markets. So we could be looking at one person's demand curve, or we could be looking at a whole market's demand curve. So here we have an example of an individual demand curve. Okay, I believe this was Catherine's demand for ice cream. At $3, she demands 0. At $2.50, she demands 2. At $2, she demands 4. And we can see how this represents the negative or inverse relationship. Price goes down. Price is the independent variable. That's going to cause the quantity demanded to increase. Quantity goes up. And then a market demand schedule would be just Catherine's demand and Nicholas's demand added together. Now, demand curves are not static. Demand curves show at one point in time how much of a good consumers are willing to purchase. However, in the background, there are constantly factors that are fluctuating, influencing consumer buying decisions. So when these factors change, these factors that underpin demand change, the demand curve is going to move. It's going to shift. We say demand is increasing. We draw it as a shift to the right, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. A decrease of demand is indicated by a shift to the left. So an increase of demand is going to look like this. The entire curve, my initial demand curve was D1. The entire curve is going to shift to the right from D1 to D2. So what that looks like is this. Initially on D1, at a price of $2, 4 units were demanded. But if on D2, at a price of $2 still, we no longer demand 4 units, we're now demanding 10. Okay? So at every price point, at $2, more is demanded. At $1, more is demanded. At $0, more is demanded. At every price point, consumers want more of this good. That's an increase of demand. The entire curve is moving to the right. A decrease of demand is the opposite. At every price point, the demand curve is actually shifting to the left. So consumers actually want fewer of each good at every price point when there's a decrease of. So for example, at $2, consumers had wanted 4. Now at $2, consumers want 0. At $1, consumers had wanted 8. Now at $1 on D2, consumers only want 4. Now, there are 5 factors that could cause this demand curve to shift. And you can remember them by the acronym IP10. Okay, I'll talk about what IP10 stands for in a second. Just remember the 5 factors that could shift the demand curve are going to be IP10. So, I stands for income. But you have to be really careful in terms of income because it depends on what type of product you're talking about. Because there really, when it comes to consumer income, there's two types of goods. The first is a normal good. That's a good consumers tend to demand more of when the economy is doing well. An example of a normal good might be a new car. The second is an inferior good. Inferior goods, consumers tend to buy more of when the economy is doing poorly. So demand for inferior goods increase when the economy turns sour, when the economy goes south. So an example of an inferior good might be a generic brand product, or shopping at Aldi as opposed to shopping at Whole Foods. An example of a normal good would then be, say, a dinner out at a fancy restaurant. When the economy goes bad, people don't go out for fancy meals. When the economy is doing well, they do, and the demand for dinner out is going to increase. The P stands for the price of related goods. And again, you have to be careful here, because when it comes to the price of related goods, we're again talking about two types of goods. There are substitutes and complements. Substitutes are goods that are bought and used in place of one another. So for example of substitute goods might be a Mac and a PC, a pen or a pencil. They're used interchangeably. They can be used in place of one another. By contrast, complements are two goods that are bought and used together. So examples of complements might be peanut butter and jelly. If the price of peanut butter goes up, since people like jelly with their peanut butter, we would assume that the demand for jelly is actually going to decrease. Substitutes are going to have the opposite effect. If the price of one good goes up, we would expect the demand for the substitute good to increase. So for example, if the price of PCs increase, I would expect the demand for Macs to increase as well. T stands for tastes and preferences. In economics, we're really not going to spend a lot of time trying to account for tastes. We're going to leave that to psychologists and different people. There's a wide range of different forces that influence taste over time. But we do realize that changes in taste can happen. A great example of this is when a fad happens. An example or a fad is when something becomes popular for seemingly no reason. A good example of a fad is when silly bands were popular and everybody was wearing silly bands up and down their arms. E stands for expectations, and it's really expectations about two things: expectations about future income and expectations about future price. If I expect my income to rise in the future, I'm going to demand more goods and services today. If I expect the price of a good that I consume often to rise in the future, let's say I expect the price of gas to go from $2 a gallon to $4 a gallon this weekend. Well, a rational person, a logical person, would probably fill up their tank, causing the demand for gas to rise today. The final factor that can shift demand is number of buyers. The overall size of the market could impact the demand for goods and services. So for example, as a city expands, demand for everything increases at every price level. When cities contract, let's say Detroit today, demand for all goods and services decline at every price level. So again, you can remember the 5 factors that shift demand with the acronym IP10. Income of consumers, the price of related goods, tastes and preferences, expectations, and number of buyers. Now, a quick note about shifting demand curves. The most common mistake in AP economics, has been the most common mistake for the last 10 years, is confusing a change in quantity demanded with a change of demand. Movements along a demand curve, so from one point on a single demand curve to another point on a single demand curve, are known as a change in quantity demanded. That's caused by a change in the price of a good. If the entire curve moves, that's called a change of demand. That's going to be caused by those 5 factors, IP10 that I had talked about: income, price of related products, tastes and preferences, expectations, number of buyers. So this is what it's going to look like. A movement along a demand curve, let's say I'm moving from point A here to point C. That's a change in quantity demanded. This is being caused because the price of the good is increasing from $2 to $4. As a result, consumers are consuming less. When the entire curve moves, that's a change of demand. This happens as a result of those IP10 factors I had been talking about. At every price, at $2, consumers had been at point A consuming 20. At point B, now they're going to consume 10.